The small-town community hall was brighter than usual that evening. Soft yellow lights hung from the ceiling, and rows of folding chairs were arranged neatly in front of a polished grand piano placed at the center of the stage. The air carried a mix of perfume, dust, and quiet excitement. People had come dressed nicely, some holding programs in their hands, others whispering to friends about who might win the showcase. At the front row sat a well-known piano instructor from the city. He had been invited as the special guest judge for the night. Many in the audience had heard about him. He had trained advanced students, performed in large halls, and built a strong reputation over the years. His posture was straight, his suit perfectly pressed, and his expression calm but serious. He had attended many events like this before, and he believed he could judge a performer within the first few seconds of hearing them play. To him, this was just another small-town music competition. He respected the effort, but he did not expect to be surprised. In his experience, local showcases were often filled with beginners who still struggled with timing and confidence. He opened his leather notebook and clicked his pen, ready to write comments that he had written many times before. Behind the stage curtain, participants waited for their turn. Some practiced quietly with their fingers on invisible keys. Others walked back and forth, repeating the first few notes of their pieces under their breath. Nervous laughter rose and faded in small waves. Near the end of the line stood a young woman wearing a simple, light-colored dress. Her shoes were plain, slightly worn at the edges. She held an old music folder close to her chest as if it were something fragile. She did not speak much. While others tried to impress each other with confident smiles, she stayed quiet, looking down at her hands. Her hands were not perfectly polished like some of the others. They showed signs of long hours of practice. The tips of her fingers were slightly rough, but steady. She gently stretched them, pressing one finger against the other as she breathed slowly. A volunteer walked by and handed her a small number card. She nodded politely and moved closer to the curtain. From her spot, she could see part of the audience through a narrow gap. The bright lights made it hard to recognize faces, but she noticed the judge sitting in the front row. He seemed serious, almost distant, as if he had already made up his mind about everyone before hearing a single note. One by one, performers went on stage. Some played short classical pieces. A few made small mistakes but continued bravely. The audience clapped kindly after each performance. The judge wrote careful notes, sometimes nodding slightly, sometimes adjusting his glasses with a quiet sigh. As time passed, the young woman's turn grew closer. Her heartbeat became louder in her ears. She closed her eyes for a moment and remembered the first time she touched a keyboard many years ago. It had not been a grand piano like the one on stage. It had been a small, second-hand keyboard placed on a wooden table at home. A few keys did not work properly. The sound was not perfect, but to her it had been magical. She had learned slowly without formal lessons. She watched videos late at night and paused them again and again to copy hand movements. Sometimes the internet connection would stop, and she would wait patiently for it to return. She practiced until her shoulders ached. There were days when she felt like giving up, but something inside her refused to stop. Back in the hall, applause broke her thoughts. Another performer had finished. Only two more people stood between her and the stage. The judge leaned back in his chair and checked his watch briefly. He was professional, but he was also tired. It had been a long day of listening to similar performances. He hoped at least one person would surprise him, but he doubted it. When the announcer called her number, a quiet murmur passed through the audience. Some people looked at the program to read her name, though many had never heard it before. She stepped forward carefully, making sure not to trip over the edge of the curtain. The stage lights felt warmer than she expected. For a second, she felt frozen. The grand piano stood before her, shining under the lights. It looked both beautiful and intimidating. From the front row, the judge glanced at her appearance. Simple dress, nervous posture, no confident smile. He had seen this many times before. In his mind, he quickly placed her in the beginner category. He prepared himself for a basic piece, perhaps played carefully but without depth. She gave a small bow to the audience. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat on the bench. She adjusted the seat quietly, then placed her music folder on the stand. But after opening it, she paused. Instead of staring at the sheet, she closed it. A few people in the audience noticed and exchanged curious looks. The judge raised one eyebrow. Playing without sheet music required confidence. He leaned forward slightly, now at least a little interested. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys but did not press them yet. She took one slow breath in, then another. The hall grew unusually quiet. Even the soft whispers from the back rows faded. In that silent moment, she felt all her years of practice resting inside her fingertips. The nights when everyone else was asleep. The mornings when she woke up early just to repeat difficult passages. The times when she doubted herself but continued anyway. She was not thinking about winning. She was not thinking about impressing the judge. She only wanted to play the music the way she had always felt it in her heart. The judge adjusted his pen again, ready to begin writing the usual comments. Good effort. Need stronger dynamics? Work on tempo. He believed he could predict the next 5 minutes. But he did not know that this performance would not be ordinary. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a brief second longer. A soft sound of someone clearing their throat echoed from the back of the hall. Then complete silence returned. She pressed down the first key. The sound that filled the hall was clear and deep, richer than anyone expected. It did not sound hesitant. It did not sound unsure. It carried weight and emotion, like a story beginning to unfold. The judge's pen stopped moving before it even touched the paper. He lifted his eyes fully to the stage, listening carefully now. Something about that single note felt different. It held control, strength, and quiet confidence. And in that very first second, before the melody had even truly begun, the evening shifted in a way no one in the hall had expected. The first note still seemed to hang in the air, even after it faded. It was not loud, yet it carried a depth that made people sit up a little straighter. The young woman did not rush into the next sound. She allowed a small pause, just long enough for the feeling to settle in the room. Then her fingers moved again. The second note connected to the first with smooth control. It was steady, confident, and full of quiet emotion. Within moments, a gentle melody began to unfold. It was not rushed or dramatic at the start. It felt careful, almost like someone slowly opening a door to a hidden room. In the front row, the judge lowered his pen completely. He had expected shaky timing or stiff hands. Instead, he heard balance. Her touch on the keys was light but certain. Each note had purpose. There was no unnecessary movement. The audience noticed the change too. A few people who had been glancing at their phones now lifted their heads. A whisper from the back row quickly stopped. The room became still. She kept her eyes on the keyboard, not looking at the crowd. Her shoulders relaxed as the melody grew stronger. The nerves she had felt behind the curtain slowly melted away. This was the only place where she truly felt calm. When she played, the world outside disappeared. As the music continued, the simple opening began to build into something deeper. Her left hand carried a soft rhythm underneath while her right hand shaped the main tune. The balance between both hands showed clear understanding. It did not sound like someone copying notes from memory. It sounded lived in, like she had spent years shaping every phrase. The judge leaned forward without realizing it. His earlier assumptions started to fade. He listened closely for mistakes, small slips in timing or uneven pressure. But there were none. Her control over the volume was careful and thoughtful. She allowed certain notes to breathe while guiding others gently forward. The piece she had chosen was not easy. It required emotional maturity and technical skill. It demanded control over speed, rhythm, and expression. Yet she handled it with quiet confidence. Somewhere in the middle rows, an elderly woman closed her eyes while listening. A young child who had been shifting in his seat became still. Even the volunteers standing near the sidewalls paused their movements. Back at the piano, the young woman felt a wave of memory pass through her. She remembered practicing this same piece in her small room at home. The keyboard there had a slightly broken key that made a soft clicking sound. She had learned to adjust her pressure so the sound would not distract her. She had played the difficult parts slowly, again and again, until her fingers moved without fear. There were nights when the power went out. She would sit in the dark and imagine the keys under her hands. She would trace invisible patterns in the air, memorizing every movement. When the lights came back, she would return to the keyboard with even more focus. All of those moments were now flowing through her fingertips. The melody shifted into a more powerful section. Her hands moved faster yet still controlled. The sound filled the hall with strength. It was no longer gentle and quiet. It was bold, almost fearless. The judge felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was not just surprise. It was something deeper. He realized he was no longer judging. He was listening. He had spent many years teaching students from wealthy families, students who had access to the best instruments and private lessons. Many of them played well. Some even played perfectly. But perfection did not always mean feeling. This performance had feeling. Her face remained calm, but her expression changed slightly with the music. When the melody softened, her eyebrows relaxed. When the rhythm grew stronger, her fingers pressed with more energy. She was not performing for attention. She was sharing something personal. A man in the back quietly wiped his eyes, surprised by his own reaction. He did not even know why the music moved him. Simply did. The judge thought back to the moment she walked onto the stage. He remembered how quickly he had labeled her as inexperienced. He had done it without thinking. Just one look at her simple dress and nervous posture had been enough. Now he felt a small sense of embarrassment. Not because she was proving him wrong, but because he realized how easy it was to judge without understanding. The music continued to rise. A fast passage came, one that required precision. Her fingers crossed smoothly over each other. The notes sounded clear, not blurred. Every movement showed hours of quiet discipline. A few people in the audience exchanged looks of amazement. They had not expected this level of skill. Some even glanced at the program again, as if checking whether they had read it correctly. The young woman did not see any of it. She was completely inside the music now. The stage lights no longer felt hot. The crowd no longer felt large. There was only the sound and the steady movement of her hands. As she approached the center of the piece, the melody slowed slightly. It became softer again, almost fragile. The hall felt smaller, more intimate. You could hear the gentle press of each key. The judge felt a chill run through him. It had been a long time since a performance had affected him this way. Over the years, he had learned to stay professional, to keep emotions separate from evaluation. But this was different. He noticed something else too. She was not showing off. There were no dramatic gestures, no exaggerated movements meant to impress. Everything was simple and focused. The music spoke for itself. The balance between strength and softness in her playing showed maturity beyond what he had expected. It was not just skill. It was understanding. In that moment, the judge understood something important. Talent does not always arrive in polished packaging. Sometimes it grows quietly, away from attention. Sometimes it builds in small rooms, in late nights, in moments when no one is watching. The piece began to build again toward another powerful section. Her hands moved with confidence, yet her posture remained calm. The sound expanded across the hall, filling every corner. A deep silence surrounded the music. No coughs, no whispers, just listening. And as she moved closer to the heart of the composition, something shifted once more in the room. It was no longer just surprise. It was respect. The respect in the room could almost be felt in the air. It was quiet, but it was no longer the quiet of doubt. It was the quiet of people who were fully present. Her hands continued to move across the keys with growing confidence. The faster section of the piece had arrived, and it demanded focus. Notes flowed one after another like a clear stream moving over smooth stones. There was no hesitation, no sudden stiffness. Each finger seemed to know exactly where to land. The judge felt his heartbeat match the rhythm for a moment. He had listened to thousands of performances over the years. He had trained his ears to notice the smallest mistake. A rushed measure, a weak transition, a lack of control in difficult passages. But what he was hearing now was something else. She was not just playing the notes correctly. She was shaping them. The rise and fall of the melody felt natural, like breathing. When the music climbed higher, it carried hope. When it dipped lower, it carried depth. It told a story without using a single word. A young student sitting near the aisle leaned forward with wide eyes. Earlier, that same student had whispered to a friend that the performer looked nervous. Now there was only admiration on that young face. On stage, she felt the energy shift. At first, she had been aware of every small sound in the hall. The creak of a chair, a cough in the back row, the soft rustle of paper. But now those sounds had disappeared. The audience was still, completely still. That stillness gave her strength. She pressed into a strong chord, letting it ring fully before moving on. The sound echoed gently against the walls, felt larger than the room itself. For a brief second, her mind flashed back to her small home. She remembered practicing this very section over and over again. It had once been the hardest part for her. Her fingers would slip. The rhythm would fall apart. She would stop, breathe, and begin again. There were times she felt frustrated. Times she wondered if she was trying to reach something beyond her ability. But she had promised herself she would not quit. Even when no one was there to encourage her. Even when progress felt slow. Now, as she played that once difficult section with smooth control, she felt something close to quiet victory. The judge noticed the transition into the next movement. It was delicate and required careful timing. Many performers rushed through it, afraid of the silence between phrases. But she allowed the silence to exist. She trusted it. That choice impressed him deeply. Silence in music is not emptiness. It is space. And she understood that. He slowly closed his notebook. He no longer needed it. The melody softened again, almost like a gentle conversation. Her touch on the keys became lighter, but never weak. The control in her fingertips showed discipline built over years. It was not dramatic or exaggerated. It was steady and honest. An older man in the second row felt his throat tighten. The music reminded him of something he could not fully explain. A memory, perhaps, or a feeling from long ago. That was the power of what she was doing. She was not simply performing for a prize. She was reaching people. As the piece moved forward, the emotional weight grew stronger. A bold section approached, filled with layered harmonies. Her left hand carried a steady foundation, while her right hand moved with speed and clarity. The sound filled every corner of the hall. The judge felt a quiet shaking in his hands. It surprised him. He had walked into the evening confident and calm, certain of his role, certain of his judgment. Now he felt small in the best possible way. He realized how quickly he had labeled her earlier, how easily he had placed her in a category without hearing her play. It had been automatic, almost careless. Watching her now, he saw more than skill. He saw dedication. He saw courage. He saw someone who had worked in silence and was finally being heard. Her posture remained simple. She did not try to impress with big movements. She did not look at the audience for approval. Her focus stayed on the music. But something inside her had changed since that first note. The fear was gone. In its place was calm strength. As she entered the emotional peak of the piece, her fingers moved faster than before. The notes were bright and powerful but still clean. No panic. No loss of control. Just steady intensity. A soft gasp escaped from someone near the back. The energy in the room felt electric. The judge's mind drifted briefly to his own early years. He remembered practicing long hours as a young student. He remembered the hunger to improve, the quiet determination, the feeling of wanting to prove something not to others but to himself. He saw that same determination on stage now. She was not trying to prove she was better than anyone else. She was proving that she belonged. The music began to slow again, preparing for the final section. The transition was smooth, almost seamless. Felt like watching waves rise and fall in perfect rhythm. Her breathing remained steady. Her hands did not tremble anymore. The stage lights no longer felt heavy on her shoulders. She had found her place at the piano. The hall felt smaller now, almost intimate. Even though dozens of people sat in their chairs, it felt like a shared moment between her and each listener individually. The final movement approached. It was the part that required both control and emotion. Too much force would make it harsh. Too little would make it weak. Balance was everything. She pressed into the keys with measured strength. The melody rose with quiet power, not rushed, not forced. Each chord carried weight. The judge felt his eyes sting slightly. He blinked, surprised by the emotion rising in him. He had attended this event expecting routine performances. Instead, he was witnessing something unforgettable. The young woman moved into the closing lines of the piece. Her hands slowed gently, guiding the melody toward its end. The final notes were not loud. They were thoughtful, intentional. The room seemed to hold its breath. And in that breath, everyone understood that they were watching someone who had been underestimated. Someone who had quietly built her strength without applause. Someone who had stepped onto the stage carrying doubt from others, but belief in herself. As the final chord approached, her fingers hovered for the smallest second. The judge leaned forward. The audience did not move. She pressed the keys one last time. The sound rang clear and steady, filling the hall with a calm, powerful finish. And in that lingering echo, something shifted forever in the heart of the man who had once thought she was just a beginner. The final chord did not disappear quickly. It lingered in the hall, resting softly against the walls before fading into silence. For a brief second, no one moved. It felt as if the entire room needed time to return to the present. She slowly lifted her fingers from the keys. Her hands, which had moved with such strength and confidence only moments before, now rested gently in her lap. Her breathing was calm, but her heart was still racing. The silence stretched a little longer. Then someone in the middle row began to clap. It was not loud at first, just two steady hands coming together. But within seconds, others joined. The sound grew stronger, filling the hall in a wave of applause that felt almost overwhelming. She blinked, surprised by the sudden noise. She had been so deeply inside the music that she almost forgot about the audience. Now she looked up for the first time since sitting at the piano. People were standing. Not everyone at once, but slowly, row by row. Faces that had once looked curious or doubtful were now filled with admiration. Some smiled warmly. Others clapped with energy that matched the emotion they had just felt. In the front row, the judge remained seated for a moment longer. He stared at the stage not because he was unsure, but because he was deeply moved. He felt something shift inside him, something that had nothing to do with scores or competition results. He realized he had almost missed this. If he had allowed his early judgment to guide him fully, he might have listened carelessly. He might have written quick notes and moved on. But the first note had stopped him. And now he understood why. He slowly stood to his feet. When he began clapping, the applause seemed to grow even louder. She felt her throat tighten. She had imagined many outcomes before walking onto the stage. She had prepared herself for polite clapping, maybe even small criticism. She had told herself she would accept whatever happened. But she had not imagined this. She stood carefully from the bench and gave a small bow. Her movements were simple and honest. She did not raise her arms or smile dramatically. She simply nodded in gratitude. The applause continued for longer than any other performance that evening. Behind the curtain, other participants watched with wide eyes. Some felt inspired. Others felt surprised. A few whispered to each other, asking how someone so quiet could play like that. The judge finally sat down again, but he did not pick up his pen. He did not need to. The announcer stepped onto the stage with a bright expression, clearly impressed. The energy in the hall had changed completely. What had started as a simple local showcase now felt like something much more meaningful. She walked off the stage slowly, her hands still warm from the keys. As soon as she passed through the curtain, the noise of applause softened behind her. For a moment, she leaned lightly against the wall backstage. Her legs felt slightly weak, not from fear, but from release. She had carried years of quiet effort inside her. And in those few minutes, she had let it all flow out through music. A volunteer approached her with shining eyes and whispered, "That was beautiful." She smiled softly and thanked them. Across the stage area, the judge stood up once more. Instead of waiting for the next performer immediately, he leaned toward the event organizer and said something quietly. A few seconds later, the announcer returned to the microphone. "Before we continue," the announcer said, "our judge would like to say a few words." A soft murmur passed through the audience. The judge walked onto the stage slowly. His steps were steady, but his expression was different from earlier. It was less distant, more thoughtful. He stood near the piano and looked out at the crowd. "I have attended many performances," he began, his voice calm but sincere, "and I have heard many talented musicians over the years. Tonight, I was reminded of something important." The hall grew quiet again. "It is easy to make quick assumptions," he continued. "It is easy to decide what we expect before we truly listen. But music has a way of humbling us." Several people nodded quietly. He turned slightly toward the side of the stage, where she stood just out of full view. "What we just heard," he said, "was not just technical skill. It was dedication. It was heart. And it was courage." The audience began clapping again, even before he finished speaking. Backstage, she felt tears gather in her eyes. Not because she wanted praise, but because she felt understood. For years, she had practiced alone. No audience, no applause, just quiet rooms and steady effort. Now someone had seen that effort. The judge stepped away from the microphone and walked toward the curtain. He paused in front of her. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then he said quietly, "I owe you honesty. When you first walked onto the stage, I thought you were inexperienced. I was wrong." His words were simple. There was no pride in them, only truth. She looked surprised, then gently shook her head. "You don't owe me anything," she replied softly. But he did not agree. "You reminded me why I started teaching music in the first place," he said. "Not for perfection, not for reputation, but for moments like this." There was no audience around them now, just two people speaking honestly. He asked her where she had trained. She explained in simple words. No formal academy, no expensive lessons, just practice at home, learning piece by piece. He listened carefully, more carefully than he had listened to anyone all evening. The next performer was already being announced, but for him, the competition no longer felt like the main focus. Something more important had happened. He returned to his seat, but his posture was different now. Less rigid, more reflective. As the evening continued, he listened to the remaining performances with fresh attention. He realized that talent does not always show itself in obvious ways. Sometimes it waits quietly for the right moment. Backstage, she sat down on a small chair, holding her music folder again. But this time, her hands were not trembling. She felt lighter, not because of applause, but because she had faced the stage and given everything she had. And somewhere in the front row, a man who once thought she was just a beginner now sat in thoughtful silence, knowing he would never judge so quickly again. The rest of the evening continued, but something had clearly changed. Even though other performers came and went, the feeling from her performance still lingered in the room. People were listening more closely now. They were paying attention in a different way. The judge found himself thinking about her again and again. He tried to focus on the next performer, writing notes as he usually did, but his thoughts kept returning to the young woman who had just walked off the stage. He remembered the way she had stepped out from behind the curtain, the way she avoided eye contact, the way he had already decided who she was before hearing her play. That memory made him uncomfortable. He had always believed he was fair. He had built his career on discipline and careful listening. Yet, in that brief moment before her performance, he had judged her based on appearance alone. As the final participant of the night finished playing, the audience applauded politely. It had been a good evening overall, but everyone knew which performance would be remembered. The organizers gathered near the side of the stage to prepare the results. Quiet conversations filled the air. Some audience members began whispering about who might win. Others were already discussing her performance with excitement. Backstage, she sat quietly on a wooden chair, her music folder resting on her lap. A few other participants smiled at her kindly. One told her that her performance gave them chills. Another admitted they had never heard that piece played with such feeling. She thanked them gently, but she did not let the praise settle too deeply. She had learned not to hold on to outside opinions too tightly. What mattered most to her was that she had played the piece the way she always wanted to. Still, her heart beat faster as she waited for the results. The judge stood near the organizers reviewing the score sheets. When it came to her name, there was no debate. The numbers were clear. But more than that, the feeling was clear. One of the organizers smiled and said quietly, "That was special." He nodded in agreement. When the announcer returned to the microphone, the hall slowly grew quiet again. People leaned forward in their seats. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," the announcer began warmly. "We have heard many wonderful performances." Each participant showed courage by stepping onto the stage. Applause followed. "Now, we will announce the top 3 performances of the evening." The third place name was called. Applause filled the room as a young performer walked onto the stage to receive a small certificate. Second place was announced next. More applause. More smiles. Then came a short pause before the final announcement. She felt her palms grow slightly warm again. She told herself not to expect anything. She had already given her best. "And first place," the announcer said clearly, "goes to the performer who reminded us all why music matters." Her name echoed through the hall. For a split second, she did not move. She almost thought she had imagined it. The applause began immediately, louder than before. Some people even cheered softly. A volunteer gently touched her shoulder. "That's you," they whispered with a smile. She stood up slowly, feeling both light and heavy at the same time. As she walked toward the stage, the applause continued. This time she looked up while walking. She saw faces smiling at her, encouraging her. When she reached the center of the stage, the judge stepped forward holding the certificate. Their eyes met for a brief moment. There was no distance in his expression now, only respect. He handed her the certificate carefully. "You earned this," he said quietly so only she could hear. She nodded, her voice too soft to respond loudly. A photo was taken. The audience clapped again. But the moment felt calm, not dramatic. After the awards ceremony ended, many people stayed in their seats instead of rushing out. Small groups formed, discussing the performances. Several approached her to say kind words. She listened politely, thanking each person. The judge waited a few minutes before walking toward her again. He did not want to interrupt the small crowd gathered around her. When the space finally cleared, he stepped closer. "May I speak with you for a moment?" he asked. She agreed. They moved slightly away from the noise, standing near the side wall of the hall. "How long have you been playing?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "Many years," she replied. "I started when I was younger. I practiced at home." "Without formal training?" he asked gently. She nodded. He let out a slow breath, not in disbelief, but in admiration. "Your control," he said, "and your understanding of the piece, that does not come easily." She shrugged lightly. "I just kept practicing." Her answer was simple, but it carried weight. He studied her for a moment, noticing the quiet confidence she now carried. It was different from the nervous posture she had shown before performing. "Have you ever considered performing on larger stages?" he asked. She hesitated. "I never thought about it seriously," she admitted. "I just love playing." That honesty impressed him even more. "There are opportunities," he said carefully. "Scholarships, advanced workshops, concerts. I would be willing to recommend you." Her eyes widened slightly, not with excitement alone, but with disbelief. "Why would you do that?" she asked. He answered without hesitation. "Because talent like yours deserves to be heard. And because tonight, you reminded me not to underestimate anyone." His words were steady and sincere. She looked down for a moment, processing everything. For years, she had worked quietly without expecting recognition. Now doors she had never imagined were being mentioned. "Thank you," she said softly. They exchanged contact information before parting. As the hall slowly emptied, she stepped outside into the cool night air. The sky was dark, filled with small stars. The noise from inside the building faded behind her. She took a deep breath. The evening had not just been about winning a prize. It had been about being seen. Inside the hall, the judge remained for a few extra minutes. He looked once more at the stage and the grand piano sitting quietly under dimming lights. He thought about how easily he could have missed this moment. How close he had been to listening without truly hearing. He picked up his notebook and flipped to the page where he had written nothing under her name. He smiled slightly. Some performances could not be captured in short comments. They could only be remembered. And as he turned off the final light and stepped out into the night, he carried with him not just the memory of a powerful performance, but a lesson he would never forget. The days after the competition did not feel completely real to her. Life returned to its usual rhythm, but something inside her had shifted. She still woke up early. She still practiced in her small room at home. The same keyboard stood against the wall. The same slightly worn keys waited under her fingers. But now, when she sat down to play, she carried a new sense of quiet confidence. The certificate from the competition rested inside her music folder. She did not hang it on the wall. She did not show it to everyone who visited. For her, the paper was not the most important part. The most important part was the feeling of that night, the moment when the hall went silent and the music spoke for her. A few days later, she received a message from the judge. It was simple and respectful. He asked if she would be willing to meet and discuss the opportunities he had mentioned. She read the message twice before replying. They agreed to meet at a small rehearsal studio in the city. It was not a grand concert hall, just a quiet place with a well-maintained piano and soft lighting. When she arrived, she felt the same nervous energy she had felt before the competition. But this time it was mixed with curiosity rather than fear. He greeted her warmly. There was no formality in his tone now. No distance. He treated her as an equal. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for inviting me," she replied. They sat near the piano and spoke for a while before she played anything. He asked about her routine, how many hours she practiced, how she chose her pieces, what music meant to her. Her answers were honest and simple. She told him she practiced whenever she could. Some days more, some days less. She chose pieces that moved her, not pieces that sounded impressive. And music, she said, felt like a place where she could be fully herself. He listened carefully. "Would you play something for me again?" he asked after a while. She nodded and sat at the piano. This time there was no audience, no competition, no bright stage lights, just the two of them in a quiet room. She began to play. The sound filled the studio, warm and controlled. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to judge, but to feel. The same honesty was there, the same steady touch. It was not a lucky performance from one good night. It was real skill. When she finished, he did not clap loudly. He simply smiled. "You have something rare," he said. "Not just talent, discipline, patience, depth." She looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. "I would like to help you prepare for larger stages," he continued. "There is a workshop coming up in a few months. It brings together advanced musicians from different places. I believe you belong there." The idea felt both exciting and overwhelming. "I've never traveled for music," she admitted. "That can change," he replied gently. Over the next few weeks, they began working together. Not in a strict teacher-student way, but in partnership. He suggested small adjustments in technique. He challenged her with new pieces that required different kinds of expression. She listened carefully and practiced with the same dedication she had always shown. Sometimes he would pause her in the middle of a piece. "What are you feeling here?" he would ask. At first, she found the question difficult. She had always focused on getting the notes right. Now she was being asked to describe emotion, Slowly, she began to understand. Music was not only about accuracy. It was about intention. With each session, her confidence grew. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the quiet kind that stands steady. Word about her performance from the competition began to spread in the community. A short video clip recorded by someone in the audience was shared online. Comments appeared from strangers who were moved by her playing. She tried not to focus too much on it, but she could not ignore the fact that people were listening. One evening, she returned home after practice and found her family waiting in the living room. They had watched the video together. Their eyes were proud, but also emotional. "We always knew you loved music," one of them said softly. "But now others can see it too." She felt tears rise, but she smiled. The workshop day arrived sooner than she expected. The building was larger than any place she had performed before. Musicians from different cities gathered, carrying instrument cases and sheet music. For a moment, old doubts tried to return. She noticed others who seemed confident and experienced. She reminded herself of the small hall where she had once been underestimated. She took a deep breath and walked inside. When her turn came to perform, she felt nervous again. But this time, she understood that nervousness was not her enemy. It was energy. She placed her hands on the piano and began. The room grew quiet, just as it had before. After she finished, there was no dramatic applause. This was not a competition. But several musicians approached her afterward to speak. They asked where she had trained. They complimented her tone and control. They spoke to her as a fellow artist. In that moment, she realized something important. She no longer felt like someone trying to prove she belonged. She simply belonged. The judge watched her from a distance that day. He did not interrupt. He did not step forward to take credit. He saw the way she stood, calm and steady among others. Later, he walked over and said quietly, "You did this. I only opened a door." She shook her head gently. "You listened," she said. "That made a difference." Months passed, and new opportunities continued to appear. Small concerts, collaborative performances, invitations to study further. But through it all, she remained the same person who once practiced alone in a quiet room. One evening, she was invited back to the small town hall where everything had begun. This time, she was not a competitor. She was the guest performer. The hall looked almost the same as before. The same lights, the same rows of chairs. But the energy was different. As she stepped onto the stage, she saw young participants waiting backstage, just as she once had. She recognized the nervous posture in some of them. Before sitting at the piano, she turned toward the audience and spoke briefly. "There was a time when I stood here feeling unsure," she said in simple words. "But music has a way of showing us who we are, if we stay patient and keep working." She did not speak long. Then she sat and began to play. The first note rang out, clear and confident. In the front row, the judge listened once again. But this time, there was no doubt in his heart. He did not see a beginner. He saw an artist. And as the music filled the hall, it carried not just skill, but a story. A story of quiet effort, humble beginnings, and the power of being truly heard.